Today we will explore the fascinating history of Damascus steel, a legendary material that has spanned millennia, continents and civilizations, shaping the art of war and the course of global trade. Prepare yourself for a journey that will take us from the ancestral furnaces of southern India to the workshops of modern blacksmiths, revealing secrets, myths, and truths about one of the most celebrated metals in human history. Before continuing with the video, remember to subscribe to the channel for more documentary narratives like this one. There is a type of metal that for centuries was shrouded in an almost mystical aura. A metal whose blades, according to accounts passed down through generations, could cut a silk handkerchief in half as it floated gently through the air. A metal whose swords in the hands of Eastern warriors made Crusader knights retreat in astonishment at its incomparable edge. This metal received many names throughout history. The Arabs called it Indian steel. The Persians had an expression to describe the blow struck by one of its blades, giving an Indian answer. In medieval Europe, it became known simply as Damascus steel. But to truly understand what this material was, where it came from, and why it matters to this day, one must take a journey back in time. A journey that begins long before the Viking Age, long before the Crusades, and that takes us to the heart of the Indian subcontinent where it all began. The origins of this story are lost in the mists of antiquity. In the fertile plains of southern India, in regions that today correspond to the states of Tamil Nadu, Karnataka, and Telangana, communities of metallurgists developed over centuries an extraordinary technique for producing steel. This technique, which Europeans would later call the crucible process, consisted of placing porous iron and carbon-rich materials, such as wood chips, bamboo, and the leaves of certain plants, inside sealed clay containers known as crucibles. These crucibles were then placed in furnaces fueled by charcoal and subjected to extremely high temperatures, which could reach between 1300 and 1400 degrees Celsius. In this intense heat, the iron absorbed carbon from the plant material, slowly melting until it formed a steel ingot with a remarkably high carbon content, generally between 1 and 2%. The result was a material of surprising purity and uniformity for the time, a steel that modern metallurgists would classify as hyper-eutectoid, that is, a steel with a carbon content above the eutectoid point, which granted it exceptional mechanical properties. This steel, produced in southern India and also in Sri Lanka, became known by the name woots, a corruption of the words for steel in various languages of southern India, such as Ukku in Tamil, Kannada, and Telugu. The production of woots was not a marginal or artisanal activity in the limited sense of the term. Archaeological evidence found at sites like Kodumanal in the state of Tamil Nadu reveals the existence of industrial centers dedicated to the manufacture of this steel dating back at least to the 3rd century before the Common Era. In Kodumanal, archaeologists unearthed fragments of crucibles, metallurgical slag and furnace remains that confirm a tradition of high-carbon steel production established more than 2,000 years ago. In Sri Lanka, sites such as Anuradhapura, Tisamaharama, and Samanalawewa have also provided evidence of crucible steel production from very ancient periods. The furnaces found in these locations were strategically positioned to take advantage of the monsoon winds, which blew from the west and naturally fed the flames, raising the temperature to the levels necessary for melting the metal. The oldest known literary reference to steel produced in India dates back to the campaign of Alexander the Great in the subcontinent at the end of the 4th century before the Common Era. According to accounts of the time, the Macedonian conqueror supposedly received as a gift 100 talents of Indian steel, a significant quantity that evidences the already established reputation of this material among the peoples of antiquity. The warriors who accompanied Alexander reported that Indian blades could split stones and cut fine fabrics in the air, descriptions that, while possibly embellished, reflected a concrete metallurgical reality. Indian steel was in fact superior to any other available in the ancient world. The superiority of woots lay in a combination of factors that Indian metallurgists had learned to control over generations. The high carbon content gave the steel extraordinary hardness, allowing the blades to maintain a sharp edge for much longer than weapons made of common iron. At the same time, the particular microstructure of woots, formed by alternating bands of cementite, a very hard compound of iron and carbon, dispersed in a matrix of ferrite or pearlite, gave the material a rare combination of hardness and toughness. This meant that a woots blade could be sharpened to an extremely delicate edge without becoming brittle, something that European blacksmiths of the time simply could not achieve with their techniques. There was, however, an additional element that made woots even more special. Modern metallurgical research conducted by scientists such as John Verhoeven of Iowa State University revealed that the formation of the characteristic patterns of Damascus steel depended on the presence of minute quantities of certain trace elements in the iron ore used. Elements such as vanadium, molybdenum, chromium, manganese, and niobium, present in concentrations of 0.03% or less, played a crucial role in the formation of the carbide bands that created the distinctive visual pattern of the steel. These elements acted as catalysts in the segregation of carbides during the slow cooling of the ingot, promoting the formation of ordered bands of cementite particles which, when the blade was polished and subjected to an acid bath, revealed themselves as undulating and sinuous lines on the metal surface. This pattern, which resembled waves in water or the rings formed by oil on a liquid surface, is what the Arabs described as watered steel, and it is one of the most recognizable hallmarks of true Damascus steel. The production process of woots involved not only the initial melting of iron with carbon in the crucible, but also a careful series of subsequent steps. After the solidification of the ingot inside the crucible, the material had to be forged with extreme care. Cementite, the iron-carbon compound responsible for the steel's hardness, is unstable at temperatures between 600 and 1100 degrees Celsius, decomposing into ferrite and carbon. This meant that the blacksmith had to work the metal within a very precise temperature range, hot enough to be malleable, but not so hot as to destroy the microstructure that gave the steel its unique properties. This control required a deep knowledge of the metal's behavior, knowledge that was passed from master to apprentice over generations and constituted one of the most well-guarded secrets of ancient metallurgy. As the centuries progressed, the woots ingots produced in southern India began to travel vast distances, driven by the commercial networks that connected the Indian subcontinent to the rest of the known world. Maritime trade through the Arabian Sea brought Indian steel to the Arabian Peninsula, where it was highly valued. In pre-Islamic and early Islamic Arabic poetry, swords made of Indian steel were given special names, such as muhannad or hendi, terms that referred directly to the Indian origin of the material and were used as synonyms for superior quality in weaponry. The fame of Indian steel was such that owning a sword forged with this material was considered a sign of distinction and power among Arab warriors. It was through these trade routes that woots ingots reached the city of Damascus in Syria, one of the greatest mercantile centers of the ancient and medieval world. Damascus occupied a privileged position at the crossroads of trade routes extending from Western Europe and North Africa to China and Japan, passing through Persia, Central Asia, and the Indian subcontinent. The city was a true melting pot of cultures, goods, and knowledge, and it was there that a thriving arms manufacturing industry developed around steel imported from India. The blacksmiths of Damascus, though they did not produce the steel itself, became masters in the art of forging woots ingots into blades of exceptional quality. They learned to work the metal at the correct temperatures, to quench and temper it in ways that maximized its hardness and elasticity, and to reveal the beautiful undulating patterns on the surface of the blades through polishing and acid etching. It was because of this association with the city of Damascus that the steel became known in the Western world as Damascus steel or Damascened steel. However, there is an interesting controversy surrounding this nomenclature. Some scholars suggest that the term Damascened does not necessarily refer to the city of Damascus, but may derive from the Arabic word damas, which means watered. In this interpretation, Damascened steel would mean watered steel, a direct reference to the characteristic visual pattern that resembled waves on the surface of water. Islamic writers from the 9th, 10th, and 11th centuries mention Damascened steel in their texts, but it is not always clear whether they are referring to steel coming from Damascus or steel with the characteristic watered appearance. What is certain, however, is that there is no evidence whatsoever that the region of Damascus possessed the ores, materials, or technical knowledge necessary to produce crucible steel. Damascus was a center of trade and forging, not of the production of the steel itself. If the Damascenes had been able to produce the steel, they certainly would have monetized that capability, given the enormous demand and the extremely high value of the material. The Arab traveler and geographer al-Idrisi, who lived in the 12th century, described Indian steel, which he called Hindwani, as the best in the world, a testament to the enduring reputation of Wootz even centuries after its export began. By the end of the 17th century, the Wootz trade had reached almost industrial proportions. Tens of thousands of ingots were shipped from the Coromandel coast in southeastern India, destined for Persia and other Middle Eastern markets. This scale of production and export is remarkable, considering that it was an activity that predated the European Industrial Revolution by centuries and depended entirely on artisanal techniques passed down orally from generation to generation. While Wootz ingots traveled west toward the Islamic world and Europe, the blades forged from this steel followed even more distant paths. It is at this point in history that we find one of the most intriguing and debated chapters of medieval metallurgy, the Ulfbert swords. These extraordinary weapons, dated between the 9th and 11th centuries, are one of the greatest enigmas of the Viking Age. Approximately 170 examples of these swords have been found, mainly in Scandinavia, the Baltic region, and parts of Eastern Europe. Each of them bears the word Ulfbert inscribed on the blade, preceded and followed by crosses, a name believed to be of Frankish origin and which possibly identified the blacksmith or workshop responsible for production. What makes the Ulfbert swords truly remarkable, however, is not the inscription, but the material from which they are made. Modern metallurgical analyses have revealed that the genuine blades of these swords were forged with high-carbon crucible steel, a material virtually identical to the Wootz produced in the Indian subcontinent. This steel contained approximately 3 times more carbon than the common iron used in sword-making in medieval Europe, which gave the Ulfbert a strength, flexibility, and edge-holding capability that were absolutely incomparable for the time. While most Viking swords were made of bog iron, a material full of impurities and slag that resulted in relatively brittle blades that were difficult to sharpen, the Ulfbert represented a qualitative leap so great that it seemed almost impossible for them to have been produced with the technology available in Europe during that period. And in fact, they were not. The most accepted theory among historians and metallurgists is that the steel used in the Ulfbert was imported, probably through the extensive trade networks that the Vikings maintained with the East. The so-called Volga Vikings, Scandinavian traders who traveled down the Volga River to the Caspian Sea, had direct access to the trade routes connecting Central Asia and Persia to the rest of the world. Through these routes, crucible steel ingots originating from India or produced in metallurgical centers in Central Asia, such as Merv in modern-day Turkmenistan or Aksiket in modern-day Uzbekistan, could reach the hands of Frankish or Scandinavian blacksmiths who possessed the skill to forge them into blades. The emergence of Ulfbert swords in the archaeological record coincides approximately with the period of greatest activity on the Volga trade route between the 9th and 11th centuries, and the disappearance of these swords also coincides with the decline of that route, a correlation that reinforces the hypothesis of steel importation. There is a particularly revealing detail in this story. Of the Ulfbert swords examined by metallurgist Alan Williams of the Wallace Collection in London, only a fraction turned out to be genuinely made of high-quality crucible steel. Many of the swords bearing the Ulfbert inscription are in fact counterfeits, blades made of common iron or inferior quality steel that were marked with the prestigious name to deceive unwary buyers. Some of these forgeries feature subtle variations in the spelling of the inscription, such as the position of the crosses relative to the letters, which experts have learned to use as an indicator of authenticity. The existence of these medieval forgeries is, in itself, a testament to the immense value attributed to genuine blades and the lucrative market that existed for superior quality weapons. Let us imagine for a moment the scene. a Viking warrior who saved for years to acquire an Ulfbert sword, believing he was buying the best steel available in the known world, only to discover, in the heat of battle, that his blade shatters upon colliding with that of an opponent. The shame, disappointment, and mortal danger represented by such a forgery are hard to exaggerate, and it is precisely this scenario that connects us to a problem that persists to this day, albeit in a different context. But before we reach the present, we must complete the story of Damascus steel in the past. To do so, we need to understand why this extraordinary technique, which had been developed and perfected over more than 2 millennia, eventually became lost. The decline of Wootz production was a gradual process, influenced by multiple factors that accumulated over centuries. One of the most significant factors was the depletion of iron ore deposits with the specific chemical characteristics necessary for the production of true damascened steel. As modern research has demonstrated, the formation of the characteristic patterns depended on the presence of trace elements such as vanadium and molybdenum in the ore. As deposits rich in these elements were exhausted, metallurgists likely noticed that their ingots no longer produced the same patterns and qualities as before, without understanding exactly why. The knowledge was empirical and transmitted orally. There was no scientific understanding of the chemical mechanisms involved. Another factor was the disruption of traditional trade routes. Wars, geopolitical changes, and the emergence of new commercial powers altered the flow of goods between India and the Middle East, affecting the supply of Wootz ingots to the workshops of Damascus and other cities. The rise of the Ottoman Empire, transformations in the Islamic world, and later European colonial expansion, all these events contributed to the dismantling of the networks that had sustained the steel trade for centuries. In the Indian subcontinent, where Wootz production had flourished the longest, the final blow came with British domination. The British Raj, the period of direct control by the British Crown over India, which formally lasted from 1858 to 1947, had a devastating impact on Indian metallurgical traditions. After the Indian Rebellion of 1857, also known as India's First War of Independence, British colonial authorities adopted drastic measures to disarm the local population. Wootz blades were destroyed, and weapon production was discouraged and in many cases prohibited. Furthermore, in 1862, forest conservation laws severely restricted local communities' access to trees, cutting off the supply of charcoal that was essential as fuel for the crucible process. Taxes on production and mining bans completed the picture of the suffocation of the traditional Wootz industry. India, which for millennia had been the primary supplier of high-quality steel to the world, was forced to import steel from Great Britain itself. The production centres that had thrived in Lahore, Amritsar, Agra, Jaipur, Gwalior, Tanjore, Mysore and Golconda were extinguished one by one, and with them went the knowledge accumulated by countless generations of metallurgists. The last records of high-quality Wootz production in India date from the mid-18th century, although residual production persisted in some areas until the 19th century. The last Damascus blades, with the highest quality patterns, were produced approximately in 1750, according to estimates by experts such as David Edge, head of conservation at the Wallace Collection in London. From then on, the technique entered an irreversible decline, and the blacksmiths who knew the secrets of the process died without passing them on to their apprentices, as the technique no longer worked with the available materials. Meanwhile, in Europe, metallurgical science was advancing in a different direction. In 1774, the Swedish chemist Torbjörn Bergman identified the role of carbon as the dominant element in the composition of steel, a discovery that revolutionized the Western understanding of metallurgy. Ironically, this progress was in part driven by European efforts to unravel the secrets of Wootz. The analysis of Indian steel samples by European scientists in the 18th and 19th centuries contributed significantly to the development of modern metallurgy. In 1820 and 1822, the celebrated English physicist Michael Faraday, the son of a blacksmith, published in collaboration with the cutler James Stoddart studies on the composition of Wootz, although they reached incorrect conclusions about the role of silica and aluminum. In the 1820s, Jean-Robert Briand, inspector of assays at the Paris Mint, conducted an impressive number of over 300 experiments in just 6 weeks, trying to reproduce the properties of Wootz by adding elements as varied as platinum, gold, silver, copper, tin, zinc, lead, bismuth, manganese, arsenic, boron, and even uranium to common steel. None of these attempts were successful in reproducing the qualities of true Damascus steel. The history of Damascus steel gains a particularly interesting chapter in Russia. In that country, crucible steel was known by the name bulat, a Russian transliteration of the Persian word fulad, which means simply steel. Bulat was mentioned in medieval Russian legends as the material par excellence for the manufacture of bladed weapons, and was associated with the swords of the armies of nomadic peoples, including the warriors of Genghis Khan. Pavel Petrovich Anosov, a Russian metallurgist and director of the Zlatust arms factory in the Ural Mountains, dedicated 10 years of his life to the attempt to reproduce Damascus steel. In 1838, after hundreds of experimental melts, many of which failed due to inconsistencies in melting temperatures and impurity control, Anosov succeeded in producing a bulat steel with a carbon content between 1.5% and 2%, melting local soft iron with charcoal and fluxes in crucibles, followed by controlled cooling. The resulting steel featured the characteristic undulating patterns on the surface and replicated the flexibility and sharp edge of historical bulat. In 1841, Anosov published his treatise titled On Bulat and Damascus Steel, in which he described the microstructure responsible for the steel's performance, including the precipitation of carbon compounds, now understood as carbides, that formed the patterned bands and improved edge retention. The Zlatust factory remained for 80 years, the only facility in the world capable of producing bullet blades with surface patterns, strength, elasticity, and a cutting edge comparable to those of historical steel. However, even Anosov's technique was not a perfect replica of the original Indian process, and many aspects of the true Wootz production method remained unknown. Bulat became popular in the manufacture of cannons until the Bessemer process, developed in the mid-19th century, allowed for the production of similar quality steels at much lower costs, making the laborious crucible process economically unviable for industrial applications. Let us fast forward now to the 20th century, when the story of Damascus steel takes an unexpected and in a way problematic turn. In the 1970s, American blacksmiths began experimenting with a technique known as pattern welding. This technique consists of stacking multiple layers of different types of steel, welding them together in the forge, and then repeatedly folding and twisting the material, creating hundreds of interleaved layers. When the resulting blade is polished and subjected to an acid etch, the different types of steel react differently, revealing undulating patterns, spirals, and streaks on the surface that can be visually very attractive. Upon observing these patterns, some blacksmiths noted their superficial resemblance to the streaks of historical Damascus steel and concluded erroneously that they had rediscovered the lost technique. From this confusion, the term Damascus steel began to be applied indiscriminately to any blade that presented visible patterns resulting from pattern welding. This mistaken association spread rapidly, not only among amateur and professional blacksmiths, but also in popular culture and, especially, in the cutlery market. The difference between true Damascus steel, Wootz, and pattern-welded steel is, however, fundamental. Wootz is a high-carbon crucible steel produced from a single ingot, in which the patterns form internally due to the segregation of carbides during the solidification and forging process. It is a hyper-eutectoid steel with a carbon content between 1 and 2%, containing specific trace elements like vanadium and molybdenum, and whose mechanical properties, including hardness, toughness, elasticity, and edge retention, result from this particular microstructure. In contrast, pattern welding is simply the joining of layers of different metals through forging, a technique that, while requiring considerable skill, produces a metallurgically completely distinct result. The patterns in pattern welding are created by the visual alternation of different types of steel, not by the internal segregation of carbides in a homogeneous steel. The mechanical properties of a pattern-welded blade depend on the steels used in the layers and the quality of the welding, not on the crucible process and the specific chemical composition that gave Wootz its legendary qualities. It is like comparing an original oil painting by a great master to a high-resolution printed reproduction. From a distance, both may look similar, but the nature, the process, and the intrinsic value of each are fundamentally different. This confusion between pattern welding and Damascus steel has concrete and measurable consequences in the contemporary market. A quick internet search for Damascus steel knives or Damascus steel swords will return hundreds of thousands of results, most of which offer products made with pattern-welded steel, not true crucible steel. These products are marketed at prices that vary enormously, from a few dozen to thousands of monetary units, and the Damascus designation is frequently used as a selling point to justify higher prices. In many cases, sellers genuinely believe that pattern welding and Damascus steel are the same thing, victims themselves of the terminological confusion established in past decades. In other cases, however, the designation is used in a deliberately misleading way to add value to a product that, while it may be of good quality, is not what it claims to be. It is important to emphasize that pattern welding is, in itself, a legitimate and respectable technique. Producing a high-quality pattern-welded blade requires considerable skill and experience, and the result can be visually stunning and mechanically satisfactory for most practical applications. There is nothing wrong with appreciating and acquiring pattern-welded blades for what they are. The problem arises when they are sold as something they are not, when the mystique of Damascus steel is invoked to justify a price that does not correspond to the actual material. This situation has direct historical parallels. Just as there were forgeries of Ulfbert swords in the medieval period, with common iron blades marked with the prestigious name to deceive buyers, today there are pattern-welded blades labeled as Damascus steel for the same purpose. The scale and context have changed, but the fundamental dynamic remains the same: the exploitation of a legendary material's reputation for commercial ends. For the average consumer, distinguishing between true Damascus steel and a pattern-welded blade is extremely difficult. To the naked eye, the patterns can look very similar. Even with some metallurgical knowledge, the distinction can be challenging without the aid of equipment, like scanning electron microscopes, capable of revealing the internal microstructure of the steel and identifying the presence or absence of the carbide bands characteristic of Wootz. This level of analysis is obviously beyond the reach of the average buyer, which makes the Damascus steel market particularly vulnerable to misconceptions and fraud. Efforts to reproduce true Damascus steel continue to this day, driven by both scientific curiosity and the persistent fascination this material exerts on blacksmiths, collectors, and historical weapon enthusiasts. In recent decades, metallurgists such as John Verhoeven and Alfred Pendre have conducted extensive research in an attempt to recreate the Wootz production process. Their work identified the crucial importance of trace elements, especially vanadium and molybdenum, in the formation of the characteristic patterns, and established the temperature and time parameters necessary for producing the ingots and forging the blades. However, even with these advances, the consistent reproduction of blades with the quality and patterns of the best historical Damascus steel remains a challenge. Verhoeven noted that, in his research, it was relatively easy to produce ingots that did not develop the patterns during forging, and that the fraction of ingots that resulted in blades with the Damascus pattern was likely quite small even in historical production. In 2006, researchers at the University of Dresden, led by Marianne Reibold, made a surprising discovery while analyzing historical Damascus steel samples with transmission electron microscopy. They identified the presence of carbon nanotubes and cementite nanowires in the steel's microstructure, structures on a nanometric scale that could contribute to the material's exceptional mechanical properties. This discovery suggested that the Indian metallurgists of antiquity, without any knowledge of nanotechnology, had empirically developed a process capable of creating structures that modern scientists only began to understand and deliberately produce at the end of the 20th century. One must also consider the impact that the loss of Wootz had on the communities that produced it. In southern India, metallurgical artisans were known as Kamari in the Telangana region, and their technical expertise was highly valued for the manufacture of war equipment and tools. With the end of wootz production under colonial pressure, these artisans lost not only their source of livelihood, but also an invaluable cultural and technological heritage. Today, village blacksmiths still work in Telangana, descendants of the artisans who once created the most coveted material in the ancient world. But none of them work with wootz anymore. The knowledge was lost, a victim of colonial policies, economic changes, and the inexorable advance of industrialization. There is, however, a deep irony in this story. Modern metallurgical science itself, which made the crucible process economically obsolete, has its roots, in part, in European efforts to understand wootz. The identification of carbon as a fundamental element in the composition of steel, performed by the Swede Bergman in 1774, was driven, according to the historian of metallurgy Cyril Stanley Smith, by European studies on Indian steel. In a real sense, wootz contributed to the birth of the very science that replaced it. The history of Damascus steel is ultimately a story about the human capacity to innovate, to transmit knowledge, and to lose that same knowledge. It is a story about the complex interactions between technology, trade, politics, and power that shaped the world we live in. The metallurgists of southern India developed, millennia before the Industrial Revolution, a technique capable of producing a material that, in many respects, rivaled the best steels available until the 19th century. This material traveled along trade routes extending from the Coromandel coast to the fjords of Scandinavia, from the plains of Russia to the deserts of Arabia, touching civilizations as diverse as those of the Vikings, the Crusaders, the Mongol emperors, and the Indian Rajas. Damascus steel was not just a material, it was a symbol of excellence, an object of desire, a currency of exchange between cultures, and a testament to human ingenuity. Its history reminds us that technological innovation is not the prerogative of any specific civilization or era, that knowledge can be created, transmitted, and lost, and that the mystique surrounding certain objects can survive long after the disappearance of the techniques that created them. For historical recreation enthusiasts, weapon collectors, and anyone interested in the intersection of history, science, and material culture, the lesson is clear. When someone offers a Damascus steel blade, it is worth asking exactly what is meant by that. If it is a pattern-welded blade, with its multiple layers of steel creating beautiful visual patterns, that is one thing, and it can be appreciated for what it is. If it is an attempt to replicate true crucible steel, with its specific chemical composition and unique microstructure, that is something else entirely, much rarer and significantly more expensive. And if it is simply a common blade with an elegant label, that is something worth knowing before opening one's wallet. The search for true Damascus steel continues. In laboratories and workshops around the world, metallurgists and blacksmiths work to unravel the last secrets of wootz, motivated by the conviction that there is still much to learn from those ancient Indian masters who, with their clay crucibles and their furnaces fueled by the monsoon winds, created a material that defied the centuries and fueled the imagination of entire peoples. And as long as this search continues, the history of Damascus steel will remain alive, not as a relic of the past but as a permanent invitation to discovery. The confusion between pattern welding and true Damascus steel, which began in the 1970s, laid the foundations for a global market that, for the most part, trades in products that are not what they claim to be. In contemporary popular culture, the idea that a blacksmith who can produce a blade with hundreds of welded layers is a master of Damascus steel has become almost an axiom. In televised forging competitions, at cutlery fairs and in virtual stores, the number of layers is often presented as a measure of quality and authenticity, when in truth, it has no relation to the process that produced true historical Damascus steel. The distinction is fundamental. In pattern welding, the patterns are created by the macroscopic alternation of layers of different materials. In wootz, the patterns result from phenomena on a microscopic and nanoscopic scale, by the segregation of carbides into bands within a chemically homogeneous steel. This difference is directly reflected in the mechanical properties of the material. The history of Damascus steel also offers us profound reflections on the nature of technological knowledge and the fragility of cultural transmission. The metallurgists of southern India developed over more than 2 millennia a corpus of empirical knowledge of extraordinary sophistication. They learned through trial and error to select the correct ores, to prepare clay crucibles with the right proportions of materials, to control temperatures and heating and cooling times, and to forge the resulting ingots in a way that preserved and revealed the microstructure that gave the steel its unique properties. All of this was done without any theoretical understanding of chemistry, crystallography, or materials science. It was purely practical knowledge, passed from master to apprentice through direct observation and practice, and kept as a professional secret within artisan communities. This model of knowledge transmission, while effective for centuries, proved extremely vulnerable to external disruptions. When the conditions that sustained Woot's production were altered, the knowledge was lost with surprising speed. In a few generations, a tradition of more than 2,000 years almost completely disappeared, leaving only ingots in museums, blades in private collections, and accounts in ancient texts as traces of its existence. Damascus steel, with all its mystique and all its reality, remains one of the most fascinating chapters in the history of human technology. It is a material that connects civilizations, crosses geographical and temporal boundaries, and continues to inspire both scientific research and popular imagination. Its story is a reminder that behind every object, every tool, every weapon, there is a complex network of knowledge, traditions, cultural exchanges, and historical circumstances that deserve to be understood and valued. For those who wish to delve deeper into this theme, the research of Verhoeven, Pendre, Gillian-Juleff, and so many other metallurgists and archaeologists offers a rich and stimulating starting point. And for those who feel tempted to acquire a Damascus steel blade, the advice is simple. Inform yourself. Ask. Investigate. A pattern-welded blade can be a beautiful and functional object, deserving of admiration on its own merits. But if what is sought is true Damascus steel, the Woots of the ancient Indian metallurgists, then one must be sure that the blacksmith who produced it masters the genuine techniques, and not just the art of creating visual patterns through layer welding. This certainty is not easy to obtain, and perhaps that is exactly why true Damascus steel remains, as it always was, a rare, precious material shrouded in mystery. In the same way that those ancient Woots ingots traveled thousands of miles to reach the hands of blacksmiths in distant lands, this account has traveled through millennia of human history to reach you here. If this journey awakened in you a curiosity about the secrets of ancient metallurgy, about the trade routes that shaped civilizations, or about the stories hidden in the objects that surround us, then it has fulfilled its purpose. And just as the master metallurgists of the past passed their knowledge forward so that the tradition would not be lost, you too can help keep this chain of discovery alive. Subscribe to the channel so that more narratives like this continue to be forged. Like this content so that it reaches other curious people like you, and leave in the comments what most caught your attention in this millennial story. Every comment, every subscription, every like is like a new layer added to this blade of knowledge that together we are forging. We,